You are not going to believe the story I'm about to tell you. Some stories are just strange. Some are scary. But this one is something else entirely. It's the kind of story that gets under your skin and stays there. The kind that makes you question everything you think you know about family and justice and the secrets buried deep in the dirt. It all started with a piece of paper, a deed to a ranch I didn't even know existed, left to me by a grandfather I barely remembered. The lawyer said the place was abandoned, a forgotten patch of earth waiting for a new owner. He couldn't have been more wrong. I rode for 2 days to get there, dust and sun beating down on me until the whole world felt like a faded photograph. When I finally saw the ranch, nestled in a valley that looked like a crumpled page from an old book, it wasn't abandoned at all. Smoke curled from the chimney like a lazy gray cat, and fresh laundry danced on a line in the breeze. It looked lived in. It looked loved. And standing on the porch, waiting for me, were 7 women. They stood in a line, silent and still as statues, their faces etched with a patience that felt ancient. And in their hands, each one of them held a photograph. It was a picture of me. Not a childhood photo, not some blurry, long-lost image. It was a crystal clear photograph of my face as it looked right now. Today. The same lines around my eyes, the same 3-day stubble on my chin. It was a picture that could have been taken yesterday, but I had never seen a single one of these women before in my life. I pulled my horse to a stop, the creak of the saddle leather the only sound in the unnerving silence. My hand instinctively went to the pistol on my hip. This wasn't a welcome. This was something else. Something calculated. The women just stared, their eyes tracking my every move. They looked at me not like a stranger, but like a package that had finally arrived, long overdue. The oldest one, her hair a cascade of silver braided down her back, stepped forward. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face. The kind of smile that says, I know all your secrets, even the ones you don't know yourself. You're late, Silas, she said, and her voice was like stones rolling in a riverbed, smooth but heavy with time. We were beginning to think you might not come at all. My name. She knew my name. How could she know my name? The lawyer was the only person who knew I was coming. I swung my leg over the saddle, my boots hitting the dusty ground with a thud that felt way too loud. My mind was a whirlwind of questions, each one sharper and more confusing than the last. Who were they? How did they get those pictures? And what in God's name did she mean? Late? Ma'am, I started, trying to keep my voice steady. I think there's been a mistake. I just inherited this place. I don't know who you are. Her smile didn't falter. It just deepened, tinged with something that looked like pity. Oh, child, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. There's no mistake. Your grandfather told us you would say that. He said you wouldn't remember. Another woman, younger, with fiery auburn hair and eyes that could strip paint off a barn door, held her photograph up next to my face. She squinted, comparing the image to the real thing, her suspicion a palpable force in the air. He looks the part, she muttered to the others, but that doesn't mean he's the one. The silver-haired woman placed a calming hand on her arm. Patience, Clarabelle. She turned her gaze back to me, her eyes seeming to look right through my skull. Your grandfather said the fever took your memories, the memories of this place, the memories of us. A cold dread, slick and oily, began to seep into my bones. The fever, I remembered it, a sickness when I was 12 that had burned through me like a wildfire, leaving behind blank spots in my childhood, patches of darkness where memories used to be. My parents had always been vague about that time. Now, standing on this porch, I was starting to understand that their vagueness wasn't forgetfulness. It was a wall, built to keep me from something, to keep me from this. He said you wouldn't understand at first, the old woman continued, gesturing for me to come closer, but that you would in time. You have to, because the promise he made, it falls to you now. Promise? What promise? My grandfather was a ghost to me, a name in a will, a man I couldn't even picture in my mind. How could I be tied to a promise made by a ghost to 7 strangers holding impossible photographs of my face? Clarabelle, the woman with the suspicious green eyes, crossed her arms. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the photograph. "Promises from dead men are just words, Maggie," she said, her voice sharp. "If he's really who he's supposed to be, he'll know about the letters. Your grandfather said he'd bring the letters." Every eye on that porch swung to me. 7 pairs of them, waiting, demanding. I felt my throat go dry. Letters? The lawyer had given me a deed, a map, and a key. Nothing else. I don't have any letter," I stammered, feeling like a fool. "Just these." I pulled the legal documents from my saddlebag, the crisp paper feeling flimsy and useless in my hands. Clarabelle let out a short, bitter laugh. "I knew it. He's an imposter." But Maggie, the silver-haired woman, just shook her head slowly, a deep sadness in her eyes. "Your grandfather said this might happen. He said sometimes men of the law hold on to things they shouldn't." She took another step forward, her gaze softening. "Come inside, Silas. There are things you need to see, things that might help you remember what you were made to forget." Her invitation felt less like a choice and more like a verdict. As I walked towards the house past the line of silent, watchful women, I had the chilling feeling that I wasn't inheriting a ranch. I was walking into a trap, one that had been set for me more than a decade ago. The inside of the house was even more jarring than the porch. It wasn't just a home, it was a shrine to me. Photographs covered every surface, the mantelpiece, the walls, the side tables, dozens of them. Pictures of me as a toddler, a gap-toothed kid, a moody teenager, and a young man. Pictures of me on fishing trips I'd never taken, at birthday parties I'd never attended, wearing clothes I'd never owned. It was my life, but it wasn't my life. My hand trembled as I reached for a photo on the mantel. It was me, maybe 10 years old, standing right outside this very house, a proud grin on my face. Beside me stood an old man, with kind eyes and a familiar jawline. My grandfather, the man I swore I'd never met. "This is impossible," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "I've never been here." "You were here every summer," Maggie said softly from behind me. "From the time you could walk until the fever. This was your favorite place in the world." The other women had followed me inside, forming a silent circle around me. They moved with a quiet purpose, their eyes filled with a shared history I was completely locked out of. It was suffocating. Clarabelle walked over to a heavy wooden chest in the corner, the kind you store old blankets and memories in. She lifted the lid. "This was yours," she said, her voice flat. She held up a small, worn leather hat. My breath hitched. I could almost feel it, the phantom weight of it on my head, the smell of sun and dust and boyish adventure. A flicker of a memory so faint it was like trying to catch smoke, danced at the edge of my mind. A treehouse, a rope swing, laughter. Then it was gone. The youngest of the women, a girl named Mercy with wide, nervous eyes, stepped forward holding a thick, leather-bound journal. "He wrote everything down," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "About you, about us, about the promise. He said you'd need this to understand." She held it out to me, an offering, but Clarabelle moved like a snake, snatching the journal from her hand before I could take it. "Not yet," she snapped, her green eyes flashing with that deep, unnerving suspicion. "Photographs and forgotten hats aren't proof. Anyone can look confused. We need to be certain." Certain of what? That I was me? It was madness. But as I looked at Clarabelle's face, I saw it wasn't just suspicion, it was fear. A deep, primal fear. Whatever secret they were protecting, it was a dangerous one. They weren't just waiting for an heir. They were waiting for a protector. Maggie sighed a long, weary sound and walked to the fireplace. She reached behind a loose stone in the hearth and pulled out a small, flat wooden box. "Your grandfather told me if you truly didn't remember, I should show you this." She opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a child's drawing. It was crude, done in crayon, depicting the ranch house with 7 stick figures standing out front. Below it, in shaky, childish letters, were the words, "My friends at Grandpa's house." The drawing hit me like a punch to the gut. The memory didn't just flicker this time, it ignited. I remembered the waxy smell of the crayons, The rough texture of the paper under my small hand. The feeling of intense concentration as I drew each of the 7 smiling figures. They weren't just stick figures. They had names. Maggie with her long silver hair. Clarabelle with her bright red hair drawn like fire. Mercy. "The last time you were here," Maggie said, her voice thick with emotion, "you gave us this drawing. You promised you'd come back when you were a man. You said you'd take care of us just like your grandpa did." A childhood promise. A promise I had no memory of making, yet one that these 7 women had built their entire lives around. The weight of it was crushing. Why would 7 grown women need the protection of one man? What could possibly have happened here that would make them so isolated, so fearful? "What happened to your husbands?" The question left my mouth before I could stop it. The air in the room instantly turned to ice. Every smile vanished. Every face became a stone mask. Clarabelle's jaw tightened so hard I thought it might crack. "That," she said, her voice dangerously low, "is not a story for your first night back." Her tone made it clear that this wasn't just a painful subject. It was a forbidden one, a dark secret that lay at the very heart of this strange inheritance. But before I could press, before I could demand an answer, a sound cut through the quiet evening air from outside. Hoofbeats, fast, approaching the house. Instantly, the atmosphere in the room exploded. The quiet, watchful women transformed into soldiers preparing for a siege. Panic, sharp and metallic, flared in their eyes. Maggie grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "They're early," she hissed, and the raw fear in her voice sent a chill straight down my spine. Clarabelle was already at the fireplace, not for a wooden box this time, but for the heavy rifle mounted above it. She pulled it down with a practiced motion that spoke of long, terrifying nights. "How many?" she demanded, her back to us. Mercy peeked through a slit in the curtains, her body trembling. "3 riders," she whispered, her voice strained. "It's them, the same ones from last month." Who were they? What was going on? The women moved with a chilling efficiency, dousing lamps, barring the door, turning their home into a fortress. I was an intruder in my own inheritance, a spectator to a war I didn't understand. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own pounding heart. Maggie pulled me away from the window, her face pale in the dim light. "Land speculators," she spat, the word dripping with venom. "Vultures. They've been circling for months, trying to force us out. They want the ranch." Clarabelle checked the rifle's chamber, her movements swift and sure. "Your grandfather kept them at bay. They were afraid of him. But he's gone now." She didn't need to finish the sentence. 7 women alone on a remote ranch were an easy target. The hoofbeats stopped right outside. A man's voice, rough and dripping with false friendliness, boomed through the door. "Ladies, we know you're in there. Just want to have a little chat about your future." Another voice, younger and crueler, laughed. "Heard you got company. Heard the long-lost heir finally decided to show his face. Why don't you send him out? We'd love to say hello." My blood ran cold. They knew I was here. How could they possibly know I was here? It meant someone was watching. A spy in town, or worse, someone on the ranch itself. My arrival hadn't been a surprise. It had been an event they were waiting for. My presence here hadn't brought safety. It had just triggered the attack. "Your grandfather told us you would know what to do," Maggie whispered, her eyes pleading with me. "He said you were strong, that you would protect us." But I wasn't strong. I was a stranger in a strange land, caught in a feud I didn't understand, surrounded by women with secrets darker than a moonless night. And outside, 3 armed men were about to kick the door down. The banging started then, a heavy, rhythmic thud against the wood that shook the whole house. It was the sound of my inheritance knocking, and it sounded a lot like a death sentence. "They've never tried to force their way in before," Clarabelle said, her voice tight as a wire. She aimed the rifle at the door. "Your being here has changed the game. It's made them desperate." The man outside shouted again, his voice losing its friendly edge. "Last chance, ladies. We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. But we ain't leaving empty-handed tonight." I looked at the 7 terrified faces around me. I looked at the single rifle in Clarabelle's shaking hands. I didn't know the full story, not even close. But I knew this. My grandfather, the man I couldn't remember, had left me more than just land. He had left me a responsibility, a duty. These women, for whatever reason, were mine to protect, and I wasn't about to fail them on my first night. Just as the wood of the door began to splinter, a crash of glass echoed from the back of the house. They'd found another way in. One of them was inside. The women gasped, grabbing fireplace pokers and heavy iron skillets. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. This was going to be a bloodbath, unless I did something completely insane. "Stay back," I ordered them, my voice sounding braver than I felt. Before they could stop me, I strode to the front door, lifted the heavy wooden bar and pulled it open. I stepped out onto the porch, into the pale moonlight, and faced the two men who were still outside. The leader was a big man, his face a road map of scars, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He looked me up and down, a cruel smirk spreading across his lips. "Well, well," he drawled. "The prince finally comes out of his castle. We were starting to think you were shy." "This is my property," I said, my voice rock solid, surprising even myself. "You're trespassing. Get off my land." The second man, younger and meaner, let out a harsh laugh. "Your property? Son, you have no idea what you walked into." Just then the third man emerged from inside the house. He wasn't empty-handed. He was carrying a worn leather satchel, holding it up like a trophy. "Found it, boss," he crowed. "Right where you said it would be. Hidden in the old chest." My eyes shot to the women huddled in the doorway. Their faces had gone from pale with fear to ashen with utter despair. Whatever was in that satchel, it was their last line of defense. And now it was gone. "Give that back," Clarabelle demanded, stepping onto the porch with the rifle raised. "That doesn't belong to you." The leader ignored her. He opened the satchel and pulled out a stack of papers, his grin widening as he scanned them. "Well now, what do we have here?" he said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "Deeds, contracts, all sorts of official-looking documents." He looked straight at me, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Turns out your grandfather was a very busy man. He promised this ranch to these 7 lovely ladies. A gift, it says, for services rendered." The younger man snickered. "Services rendered, I bet." The insult hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Clarabelle's knuckles turned white on the rifle stock. "Watch your mouth." "Or what?" the leader sneered. "You'll shoot me?" "I don't think so." He waved the papers in the air. "Besides, these documents aren't worth the paper they're written on. Never filed with the county, never properly witnessed. They're just a dead man's wishes. And the law doesn't care about wishes. It cares about legal heirs. And that, son," he said, pointing a thick finger at me, "is you." It was a brilliant, cruel trap. He wasn't just trying to scare the women. He was trying to turn me against them. He was telling me the land was mine and mine alone, that their claims were meaningless. He was giving me an easy way out. All I had to do was step aside and let him take what he wanted. "We'll make you an offer," the leader continued, his voice turning smooth as oil. "We take the ranch. We pay you a handsome price for it. And we give the ladies enough cash to start new lives somewhere far away from here. Everyone wins." Maggie stepped forward, her back straight, her voice filled with a dignity that defied the pistol pointed in her direction. "And if we refuse?" The leader's smile vanished. His face became a cold, hard mask of cruelty. "Then we don't just file for the land. We file these other papers, too." He reached back into the satchel and pulled out another, smaller sheaf of documents. "Some interesting public records I had my lawyer pull. Coroner's reports, missing persons files." He let the words hang in the air for a moment, enjoying the wave of pure terror that washed over the women's faces. "Funny thing," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Seems all 7 of you ladies became widows in the exact same month, just over 10 years ago. All 7 of your husbands, hard-working men, all vanished without a trace." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "We have 3 days. You can take our money and disappear, or you can stay and try to explain to a judge how 7 husbands all disappearing at once is just a tragic coincidence." He and his men mounted their horses, their laughter echoing in the night as they rode away. They left behind a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than any sound. The truth was out. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to destroy everything. I turned and looked at the 7 women. Their faces were shattered masks of guilt and fear. The secret they had guarded for a decade was now a weapon aimed at their hearts. I finally understood. My grandfather hadn't just offered them a home. He'd offered them a hiding place. 7 husbands, I said, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. All in the same month. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. And as I stood there on that moonlit porch, I realized my inheritance wasn't a ranch. It was a conspiracy to commit murder. The silence that followed the men's departure was a living thing, thick with unspoken horrors. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Maggie, the matriarch, sank into a porch chair, the strength seeming to drain out of her all at once. She looked ancient, her face a canvas of sorrow. "Your grandfather saved us," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "He saved us from monsters who wore the faces of husbands." Clarabelle, ever defiant, slammed the useless rifle butt against the porch floor. She faced me, her chin high, her green eyes blazing with a mixture of shame and fury. "My husband," she said, her voice tight and clipped, "liked to use his fist to settle arguments. He broke my arm twice, my ribs once. He called it a husband's right. The day he turned his eyes on my little sister, I knew one of us was going to end up in the ground. I decided it wasn't going to be me." She pushed up her sleeves, revealing a latticework of pale, silvery scars on her forearms. They were old wounds, but they screamed a story of relentless brutality. One by one, the other women began to speak, their voices trembling but determined. It was a litany of nightmares. Mercy, the youngest, spoke of a husband who sold her to other men for drinking money, telling her a wife was property, nothing more. Another woman told of watching her husband sell their children's winter food for a hand of cards. Stories of degradation, of violence, of souls being ground into dust day after day. They weren't just wives, they were prisoners of war, and their homes had been the battlefield. "Your grandfather saw it," Maggie continued, her gaze distant, lost in memory. "He saw the bruises we tried to hide, heard the crying we tried to stifle. He offered us an escape, a way out, but he said it would take courage. He said we'd have to be willing to die." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, die?" Clarabelle met my gaze, her own eyes hard as flint. "He meant we had to disappear, let the world think we were dead, right alongside our husbands. It was the only way to be truly free, the only way they, or their families, would ever stop looking for us." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and it was more horrifying than I could have imagined. "The mine accident," I breathed, remembering the papers the man had mentioned. "The collapse at the old silver mine 10 years ago." Mercy nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't an accident. Your grandfather knew that mine was a death trap. He knew it was going to come down sooner or later. He just helped it happen at the right time, with the right people inside." There it was, the truth, ugly and undeniable. My grandfather, the kind old man from the photograph, had orchestrated the deaths of 7 men. He had sheltered their widows, helped them fake their own deaths, and given them a fortress where they could hide from the world. He wasn't just a protector, he was a vigilante, a killer who dealt his own brand of justice with earth and rock. "And those men who were just here," I said, thinking aloud, they know. They know the truth, and they're using it as blackmail to get the ranch." "They're vultures," Maggie repeated, her voice laced with venom. "They suspected something wasn't right from the beginning, but they were too afraid of your grandfather to act. With him gone, they see their chance. They don't just want the land. They want to punish us for surviving." Clarabelle stepped so close to me I could see the flecks of gold in her fiery green eyes. Her suspicion was gone, replaced by a desperate, challenging intensity. "So now you know," she said, her voice low and powerful. "You know what you've really inherited. Not just some dirt in a house. You've inherited us. You've inherited his promise. The responsibility for protecting 7 murderers." She stared at me, her gaze pinning me to the spot. "The question is, Silas, what kind of man are you? Are you your grandfather's grandson? Or are you just another man who's going to stand by and watch us be destroyed?" The weight of her question, of their stares, of the entire impossible situation settled on my shoulders. I had a choice. I could ride away, leave them to their fate, and wash my hands of this bloody inheritance, or I could stay. I could fight. I could become the man my grandfather believed I was, the man a 10-year-old boy had promised to be. I walked over to the wooden chest and picked up the little leather hat. It felt different in my hand now. It wasn't just a relic of a forgotten childhood. It felt like a crown, a heavy one. I finally looked up and met Clarabelle's gaze. "Get the journal," I said. "We've got 3 days to figure out how to fight monsters." A flicker of something, hope maybe, danced in her eyes. For the first time since I'd arrived, the women on the porch didn't look like strangers. They looked like family. A broken, terrified, and dangerous family. And I was one of them. We spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, the single lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and fear. Mercy brought me the journal, her hands still trembling as she placed it on the table. It felt heavier than leather and paper ought to. It felt like a tombstone. I opened it. My grandfather's handwriting was surprisingly elegant, a stark contrast to the brutal story it told. He hadn't just written down his plan. He had documented everything. It was a ledger of sins. Each woman's story was there, detailed with a cold, meticulous rage. He'd recorded dates of beatings, transcribed verbal threats, and even included sketches of bruises. He had built a case against each of these men, as if he were a prosecutor preparing for a trial where he would be the judge, jury, and executioner. The plan for the mine accident was laid out with chilling precision. He'd studied the old mine for months, knew its every weakness. He'd used a small, calculated dynamite charge to trigger the collapse, making it look like an act of God. It was brilliant. It was monstrous. But as I read deeper, I realized there was more to it. Tucked into the back pages, written in a faint spidery script, were notes that didn't fit. Mentions of a failsafe, a final account, and a name I didn't recognize, Elias Thorne. This wasn't just a diary, it was a blueprint, and I had a sinking feeling the plan wasn't finished. "Who is Elias Thorne?" I asked, looking up at the exhausted faces around the table. A wave of confusion passed between the women. "I've never heard that name," Maggie said, frowning. The others shook their heads. "My grandfather mentioned him in the last few entries," I explained. "He writes, 'Thorne is the key. If they ever come for the ranch, the Thorne account will be the final word.'" What did it mean? Was it a person? A place? A hidden bank account? It was a loose thread, and in my experience, loose threads are the ones that can unravel everything. The next morning, I knew I couldn't just sit and wait for the vultures to return. I had to go on the offensive. "I'm riding into town," I announced. "I need to talk to the lawyer, and I need to find out who Elias Thorne is." Clarabelle immediately objected. "It's a trap, Silas. They'll be waiting for you. Kane, the leader, he's not stupid." "That's his name? Kane?" I asked. She nodded grimly. "Jedediah Kane. He's been the one leading the charge since the beginning." "Then I need to know who he is too," I said. "Sitting here makes us a bigger target. We have to take the fight to them." The ride to town was tense. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. When I reached the lawyer's office, Mr. Abernathy was a bundle of nerves. He was a small, mousy man who looked like he'd be more comfortable hiding behind his books than dealing with the kind of trouble I'd brought to his doorstep. "The letters," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "The ones my grandfather left for me. The women on the ranch said you were supposed to give them to me." Abernathy started sweating, dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Ward. I gave you everything the estate required." He was lying. It was as plain as the fear on his face. I leaned forward, placing my hands on his desk. "Jedediah Kane. He got to you, didn't he? He's threatening you." The lawyer flinched as if I'd struck him. He looked around his office, at the door, the windows, like he was a caged animal. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "This man, he's not just some land speculator. He has connections. He knows things." "What things?" I pressed. "Things about the past," Abernathy whimpered. "Things that are better left buried." He came to me weeks ago, right after your grandfather passed. He knew you were inheriting. He told me to keep the letters, to say nothing about them. He said it would make things smoother. Blackmail. Kane was blackmailing the lawyer. But why? What was in those letters that he was so desperate to keep from me? Where are they, Abernathy? With a trembling hand, he pointed to a floor safe hidden behind a large painting of a ship at sea. I didn't wait for him to open it. I moved the painting, saw the safe, and looked at him. He gave me the combination with a defeated sigh. Inside was a single, thick envelope sealed with wax. My grandfather's wax seal. I took it. One more thing, I said, turning back to the terrified lawyer. I need to know everything you know about Jedediah Kane, and I need to know if you've ever heard the name Elias Thorne. At the mention of Thorne, Abernathy's eyes widened in recognition. Thorne? He was a private investigator, lived a town over. Your grandfather hired him about a year before he passed. A very discreet, very expensive man. A private investigator. My grandfather had hired a P. Why? What was he looking for? And Kane? Abernathy shook his head. He's just a bully with money and a grudge. Says the ranch should have been his. Claims his family has a historical claim to the valley, but it's nonsense. Something about his answer felt wrong. Too simple. Kane's hatred felt personal, not financial. But I had the letters. That was the important thing. I left Abernathy sweating in his office and found a quiet corner in the town saloon to open the envelope. Inside weren't letters. It was a single, folded document. It was a detailed report from one Elias Thorne, private investigator. The subject of the investigation, Jedediah Kane. My blood turned to ice as I read. Kane wasn't just a speculator. He wasn't just a bully. He was the brother of one of the men in the mine. Martin Kane, a man described in my grandfather's journal as the most vicious and cruel of all the husbands, a man who had abused his wife, Clarabelle. This wasn't about land. It wasn't about money. This was about revenge. Jedediah Kane believed his brother had been murdered, and he suspected the widows on the ranch were responsible. He'd been hunting for proof for 10 years. My grandfather's death was the opening he needed. He was coming for the ranch not just to claim it, but to tear it apart, to find the evidence he needed to see those women hang. And I had just walked right into the middle of his decade-long quest for vengeance. The Thorne account wasn't a bank account. It was this report. My grandfather hadn't been investigating Kane. He had been investigating the man who was hunting his family. This was the failsafe. I rode back to the ranch at a gallop, the investigator's report feeling like a burning coal in my pocket. The 3-day deadline was no longer a negotiation tactic. It was a countdown to a bloodbath. When I stormed back into the kitchen and told them who Kane really was, the last vestiges of hope in the room died. Clarabelle's face went white. She sank into a chair, looking utterly broken. Martin's brother, she whispered. He was always protective of him. He never believed Martin was capable of what he did. He doesn't want the ranch, I told them, my voice grim. He wants you, all of you. He's been biding his time, waiting for his chance to prove what he suspected all along. Panic erupted. The women started talking at once, their voices a chaotic symphony of fear. They talked about running, about splitting up and disappearing again, but I knew it was too late for that. Kane had been watching them for a decade. He knew their faces, their routines. They wouldn't get a mile. Running isn't an option, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. Fighting is the only way. Fighting how? Maggie asked, her voice trembling. He has the law on his side, Silas. He has suspicion and rumor. What do we have? We have the truth, I said, and we have whatever else my grandfather left for us. I looked back down at the journal, at the spidery notes in the back. Thorne is the key, but I had the Thorne report. It felt like I was still missing a piece, the final account. It had to mean something more. I started pacing the room, my mind racing. My grandfather was a meticulous planner. He wouldn't have left them vulnerable. He wouldn't have left their fate up to chance. The failsafe had to be more than just information. It had to be a weapon. I went back to the chest, The one where they'd kept the hat and the fake deeds. I emptied it, tossing out old clothes, forgotten toys, bundles of yellowed receipts. And at the very bottom, taped to the cedar planks, was another envelope. This one was thin, almost flat. Inside was a single brass key and a small folded piece of paper. On it was another one of my grandfather's cryptic notes. Sometimes the worst sins aren't buried in the ground, they're buried in the open. Underneath the words was a crude drawing, a sketch of the old smokehouse that stood behind the main building, and an X marked on the floor. It wasn't a bank account, it wasn't a report. The final account was a place, a hidden cellar. My grandfather had buried something, something he believed would be their salvation. Get the lanterns, I said to the women, a surge of adrenaline cutting through my fear. We're going digging. The smokehouse was ancient, the air inside thick with the ghosts of 1,000 smoked hams. Dust motes danced in the beams of our lanterns. The floor was made of heavy, packed earth. We found the spot from the drawing and started digging. The work was hard, frantic. Every shovelful of dirt felt like a second ticking off the clock. About 2 feet down, my shovel hit something hard. Wood. We cleared the dirt away and uncovered a heavy trapdoor with an iron ring. It was locked. The brass key from the envelope slid into the lock with a satisfying click. I pulled the door open. A wave of musty cold air washed over us. Below was a small stone-lined cellar, no bigger than a closet. And inside, sitting on a single wooden shelf, was a heavy metal lockbox. This was it, the final account, the weapon my grandfather had left behind. I carried the box back to the kitchen and set it on the table. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid and we all leaned in, holding our breath. It wasn't gold, it wasn't money, it was evidence. My grandfather, the meticulous prosecutor, had collected proof. Letters the husbands had written, filled with their drunken, cruel words. Photographs of the women's injuries, taken in secret. But there was something else. A small bound ledger. I opened it. It contained detailed financial records, records of payments. Payments made by Martin Kane, Clarabelle's husband, to the other 6 men. My jaw dropped. What is this? Clarabelle peered over my shoulder, her eyes widening in disbelief. I don't understand. But as I read the entries, a new, even more sickening truth began to dawn on me. Martin Kane wasn't just an abuser. He was a criminal. He had been running a smuggling operation, using the remote ranch as a way station. And the other 6 husbands weren't just his friends. They were his employees, his muscle. They weren't just abusive husbands who happened to find each other. They were a gang led by Martin Kane. The beatings, the cruelty. It wasn't just random domestic violence. It was a tool of control, a way to ensure their wives stayed silent, too terrified to ever go to the authorities. But the most damning discovery was on the last page of the ledger, a signed confession. Not from Martin Kane, but from one of the other husbands, a man who, apparently, had grown a conscience in his final days. He had written it all down, the smuggling, the violence, Martin's leadership. He had given it to my grandfather just before the accident. This changed everything. The women weren't just victims of domestic abuse. They were witnesses to a criminal conspiracy. My grandfather hadn't just saved them from their husbands. He had saved them from a dangerous criminal enterprise. But as this wave of relief washed over me, I saw something that made my heart stop. A discrepancy, a detail that didn't fit. My grandfather's journal listed the 7 men who were in the mine. The confession listed the 7 members of the gang. 6 of the names were the same, but one was different. According to the confession, one of the husbands, a man named Silas Blackwood, the same first name as me, was not part of the gang. He was an outsider who had been hired to work the claim, an innocent man who had no idea what was really going on. He had died in the mine collapse alongside the 6 criminals. An innocent man had been killed. My grandfather had sacrificed a pawn to get the king. The moral high ground we were standing on crumbled into dust. But the true shock, the twist that felt like a knife in my gut, came when I compared the gang roster to the list of the dead from the mine. One name on the gang roster was not on the list of the dead, and one name on the list of the dead was not on the gang roster. My grandfather hadn't just killed an innocent man. He had missed one of the guilty ones. Martin Cain, Clarabelle's husband, the leader of the gang. He was never in the mine. My head snapped up, my eyes locking with Clarabelle's. She was staring at the ledger, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She knew. She had known all along. Clarabelle, I said, my voice dangerously quiet, where was your husband that day? A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Her voice was a choked whisper. He was supposed to be there. He told me he was going to the mine with the others, but he never came home that night. I always thought, I hoped he had just run off. I was too scared to even consider. Her words trailed off, but the truth hung in the air between us, as sharp and as real as a hangman's noose. Jedediah Cain wasn't Martin's brother, seeking revenge for a man he thought was a victim. Jedediah Cain was Martin Cain. He hadn't died in the mine. He had escaped. He had let the world think he was dead for 10 years, let his own brother mourn him, all while he was watching, waiting, building his resources. And now he was back, under a new name, to reclaim his land, his criminal enterprise, and to finish what he started by eliminating the only witnesses left, his wife and the 6 other women. We weren't dealing with a grieving brother. We were dealing with the monster himself, and he was coming back to finish the job. We didn't have 3 days. We had until sundown. The deadline wasn't a negotiation. It was his grand finale. He was coming to wipe the board clean, and he'd be coming with enough men to make sure that this time there were no survivors. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The monster wasn't at the gates. He'd been hiding in plain sight the whole time. Martin Cain was alive, and he was coming home. The fear in the room was no longer a quiet dread. It was a screaming, suffocating panic. "We have to run," Mercy cried, her face buried in her hands. "We have to leave right now." "And go where?" Clarabelle shot back, her voice brittle with a terrifying new resolve. The broken woman from moments ago was gone, replaced by someone forged in 10 years of fear and a lifetime of abuse. Her eyes were burning. "He's been watching us for a decade. He knows every path out of this valley. Running is just choosing how you want to die." She was right. Cain, Martin, wouldn't let them escape. He wasn't just tying up loose ends. This was personal. He was coming to reclaim his power, to punish the woman who had dared to survive him. "Then we fight," I said, my voice cutting through the panic. "We don't fight him on his terms. We fight him on ours, on our grandfather's terms." All eyes turned to me. I walked over to the table and laid out the journal, the ledger, and the confession side by side. "Your grandfather wasn't just a vigilante," I said. "He was a strategist. He didn't just react. He planned. He set traps. And that's exactly what we're going to do." The plan began to form in my mind, a desperate, crazy gamble built on the foundations my grandfather had laid. We couldn't outgun them, but maybe, just maybe, we could outsmart them. "He's not coming for you," I said, looking at the 7 women. "Not at first. He's coming for this." I tapped the ledger. "He thinks this proves his ownership, that it's a map to his old smuggling profits. He doesn't know it's a confession that could hang him. He's greedy, and we're going to use that greed against him." My first move was a ride back to town, faster and more reckless than before. I didn't go to Abernathy's office. I went to the sheriff. Sheriff Brody was an old, weathered lawman who looked like he'd seen it all. I threw the confession and the ledger on his desk. "Martin Cain is alive," I told him. "He's going by the name Jedediah Cain, and he's been running a criminal operation in your county for over a decade. He's coming to my ranch tonight to kill 7 witnesses." Brody read the documents, his face growing grimmer with every page. "I always knew something wasn't right about that mine collapse," he grumbled. "And I've had my eye on Cain for a while. Never had anything that would stick." He looked up at me, his eyes sharp. "This is enough to get a warrant, but he's got at least a dozen men on his payroll. By the time I get a posse together and ride out there, it'll be too late." "I don't need a posse to ride in with guns blazing," I said. "I need you to be the trap. I'm going to lure Cain and his men to the ranch. I'm going to get them all in one place. And when I give the signal, I need you and your deputies to seal the valley." It was a long shot, but Brody agreed. He saw the chance to finally bring down a man who had been a thorn in his side for years. I rode back to the ranch with a sliver of hope. The trap was set. Now we just had to bait it. Using Abernathy as an unwilling go-between, I sent a message to Kane. I told him I'd found my grandfather's real treasure, a stash of gold bars from his smuggling operation, hidden in the old mine. I told him I was willing to trade the gold and the ranch for the safety of the women. I told him to meet me at the mine entrance at sundown, alone. Of course, I knew he wouldn't come alone, and we weren't going to be at the mine. The rest of the day was a blur of frantic preparation. The women, their fear now channeled into focused determination, worked like a well-oiled machine. They knew this ranch better than anyone. They knew its secrets, its hidden paths, its strengths. We weren't fortifying the house. We were fortifying the land itself. We set up our stand at the old smokehouse, the site of the hidden cellar. We rigged a series of traps my grandfather had sketched in the margins of his journal. Simple, brutal things designed to slow an enemy down. Tripwires connected to heavy falling logs. A covered pitfall on the main path. Clarabelle, it turned out, was a dead shot with that rifle. She took up a position in the hayloft of the barn, giving her a clear line of sight to the smokehouse. The other women armed themselves with what they could. Shotguns, pistols, even a hunting bow. They weren't helpless victims anymore. They were warriors defending their home. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, casting the valley in hues of blood and fire, we saw them coming. A cloud of dust on the horizon. It wasn't one rider, it was at least 10. Martin Kane was bringing his entire army. My heart pounded against my ribs. The plan felt thin, fragile. One wrong move, and we would all be dead. I took my position inside the dark smokehouse, the heavy lockbox at my feet. This was the bait. Kane and his men rode into the ranch yard with an arrogant swagger. He was bigger than I remembered from the porch, his face hardened by a decade of malice. He dismounted, his eyes scanning the seemingly deserted ranch. "Ward," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the twilight. "I know you're here. You've got something of mine." I stepped out of the smokehouse holding a single lantern. "It's all here, Kane. Or should I say, Martin." His face darkened at the use of his real name, but a greedy smile quickly replaced it. "Clever boy. Doesn't matter. The gold is what I'm here for. Show it to me." "It's in the cellar," I said, gesturing to the trapdoor. "Just like you, it's been buried for 10 years. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He ordered 2 of his men forward. "You 2, go get it. The rest of you, keep your eyes open." This was the moment. The 2 men stepped into the smokehouse. As they bent down to open the trapdoor, I gave a silent signal. From the hayloft, Clarabelle fired. It wasn't a killing shot. She hit the lantern held by one of Kane's men in the yard, plunging the area into sudden, disorienting darkness. In that same instant, the women behind the house lit the signal fire, a pile of oil-soaked wood we had prepared. A massive plume of smoke and flame shot into the sky. It was the signal for Sheriff Brody. Chaos erupted. Kane's men started shooting blindly into the dark. The 2 men in the smokehouse with me were momentarily stunned. That was all the opening I needed. I kicked the trapdoor shut and threw the heavy bar across it, trapping them inside. From the darkness, the women opened fire. They weren't aiming to kill. They were aiming to confuse, to panic. Gunshots echoed from the barn, from behind the water trough, from the roof of the main house. To Kane's men, it sounded like they were surrounded by a small army. They were pinned down, their horses spooked, their vision obscured by the night. Kane roared orders, trying to regain control, but his men were terrified, firing at shadows. He had walked into a hornet's nest. The first of our traps was sprung. A man trying to flank the barn ran straight into the tripwire, and a heavy log swung down from the trees, sweeping him off his feet with a sickening crack. Another stumbled into the pitfall near the creek bed. It was working. We were using their numbers and their arrogance against them. Kane, realizing he'd been tricked, turned his full fury on the smokehouse. "Ward, you're a dead man." He and his remaining men charged forward, using a heavy fence post as a battering ram against the smokehouse door. The wood began to splinter. I knew I only had seconds. I backed into the cellar, pulling the heavy ledger, the real prize, with me. The doors burst open, and Martin Kane stood there, his face a mask of pure rage, silhouetted against the burning signal fire. "It's over, Martin," I said from the shadows of the cellar. He raised his pistol to fire, but just as he did, a single shot rang out from the hayloft. It wasn't a warning shot this time. The bullet hit Kane's gun hand, sending his pistol flying into the dirt. He screamed in pain and fury. It was Clarabelle. She stood in the hayloft, rifle steady, her face grim and determined. She had faced her monster and, with one perfect shot, she had disarmed him. That's when we heard it. The thunder of hoofbeats from the mouth of the valley. Sheriff Brody and his deputies had arrived. They rode into the ranch yard, surrounding Kane and his bewildered, terrified men. It was over. Martin Kane was arrested, his true identity revealed, his reign of terror finally at an end. His men, caught red-handed in an armed assault, surrendered without a fight. The ledger and confession sealed their fates. In the aftermath, as the sheriff's men led the prisoners away, the 7 women emerged from their hiding places. They were dirty, exhausted, and trembling, but they were standing tall. They had faced their past, and they had won. Clarabelle came down from the hayloft, and for the first time, I saw a genuine smile on her face. It was a smile of freedom. I looked around at the ranch. My ranch. It wasn't an inheritance of land or money. It was an inheritance of courage, of survival, of a strange and fierce kind of family. My grandfather hadn't left me a burden. He had left me a purpose. He had trusted that his blood ran true, that when the time came, I would know what to do. Standing there, under a sky full of stars, with 7 of the strongest women I had ever met by my side, I finally felt like I was home. The past was buried, the monsters were caged, and the future was ours to build. This story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are the secrets we keep to protect the ones we love. And that justice doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from a well-laid plan and a steady hand. If you were moved by this story of survival and long-awaited justice, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what other secrets are buried out there, just waiting to be uncovered.